Your medicine cabinet is now a geopolitical battlefield, and most Americans have no idea what is quietly happening to the supply chain that keeps them alive. Think about that for a moment. The drugs sitting on your nightstand, the HIV treatments, the antidepressants, the antibiotics, many of them do not originate where you think they do. They pass through a global web so complex, so tightly wound, that a single policy decision in Washington can ripple outward and leave your local pharmacy with empty shelves within weeks. And that decision has now been made. President Trump has imposed a 100% tariff on patented pharmaceutical products and their ingredients under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, framing it as a matter of national security and public health. 100%. That is not a negotiating posture written on a napkin. That is a signed executive order. That is the law of the land. And what it means for the average American, for the person who fills prescriptions every month, who manages a chronic illness, who relies on medication to function, is something the mainstream conversation is barely beginning to address with the seriousness it deserves. This is bigger than a trade dispute. This is a restructuring of the global order of medicine itself, and the consequences are only beginning to surface. Now let us take a step back and look at this with clear eyes, because the noise around this story is tremendous and the clarity is very thin. The administration's stated rationale is straightforward enough. The Commerce Department investigation found that patented pharmaceuticals and associated ingredients are being imported into the United States in quantities and under circumstances that threaten to impair national security. And to be fair, that concern is not manufactured out of thin air. The United States is in a genuinely precarious position when it comes to pharmaceutical self-sufficiency. Decades of offshoring production, first to Europe, then to India, then to China, have left America dependent on foreign supply chains for the very substances that keep its population alive and functioning. That is a real vulnerability. That is a real problem. But the question we need to sit with is this: does a 100% tariff solve that problem, or does it create a new and perhaps more immediate crisis while the long-term solution is still years away from becoming real? Because here is what we know about the current landscape. The United States imports 400 different ready-for-use medications from Canada alone, 28 of which have no alternative supplier anywhere in the world. Read that again slowly. 28 medications that Americans depend on, and there is no backup plan, no alternative source, no plan B sitting in a warehouse somewhere. If the supply chain for those drugs gets disrupted, not destroyed, just disrupted, just squeezed, those patients feel it almost immediately. And Canada is not even the biggest piece of this puzzle. It is just the most visible because of the political friction between Washington and Ottawa that has defined this entire era. Canada represents a significant player in the drug landscape, and straining this supply chain could trigger drug shortages and jeopardize patient care. Those are not the words of a fringe alarmist. Those are the conclusions of researchers at the University of Toronto, at the Hertie School in Berlin, at the University of Pittsburgh. Serious people looking at serious data, arriving at a serious conclusion. Now, the administration would have you believe that this policy is already working, that it is already producing results, and there is something to that. The impending Section 232 tariffs have already spurred approximately $400 billion in new investment commitments from U.S. and foreign pharmaceutical companies to be spent in the United States during Trump's current term. $400 billion. That is a staggering number, and it is worth acknowledging. Companies like Eli Lilly, Pfizer, Novo Nordisk, they are not sitting still. They are reading the room, they are cutting deals, signing agreements, announcing domestic manufacturing commitments. The threat of tariffs helped drive 13 drug companies to make most favored nation pricing deals with the White House late last year. So the leverage is working, at least in part. The pressure is producing movement. But, and this is the part that deserves far more attention than it is getting, investment commitments and shovel-ready factories are two entirely different things. You can announce a billion-dollar plant today. That plant will not produce a single pill for 5, 6, 7 years. So what happens in the gap? What happens to the American patient in the years between the press release and the ribbon cutting? That is the uncomfortable space this policy has created, and it is one the White House prefers not to linger on. According to industry experts, the new tariffs will likely have the most impact on small and mid-sized manufacturers of brand-name medications, companies that typically manufacture in Canada, Mexico, or the Middle East, and cannot afford to spend billions on building new facilities in the United States. This is the structural reality that the big headline obscures. The Pfizers of the world will be fine. They have the capital, the legal teams, the political relationships to navigate this. They will cut their deals, sign their agreements, and continue operating. It is the smaller companies, the ones making niche medications for rare conditions, the ones with thin margins and limited options, that face a genuinely existential pressure. The CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization said that immediate punitive 100% tariffs on innovative medicines for any company without shovels in the ground would devastate small and mid-sized biotechnology companies. Devastate. That is not hyperbole. That is an industry leader describing what happens when a blunt instrument meets a complex, fragile ecosystem, and the complexity of that ecosystem cannot be overstated. People think of a pharmaceutical supply chain the way they think of a simple transaction. A factory somewhere makes a pill and ships it to a pharmacy. But that is not how it works. Not even close. Active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, the actual chemical compounds that make a drug work, are manufactured in one country. They are processed in another. The finished product is assembled in a third country, quality tested in a fourth, and then distributed globally. When you impose a 100% tariff at any point in that chain, you are not just adding a cost. You are disrupting a choreography that took decades to build and that has no easy substitute. Shortages do not pay attention to borders when supply chains are global. The concern is, as this ripples around the world and more tariffs are placed by Americans on Canada, Europe, China, and India, a supply chain that might tighten even further is beginning to emerge. That is the global dimension of this story that most American news coverage is failing to capture. This is not a Canada-USA spat. This is a rearrangement of global pharmaceutical trade that will produce winners and losers in ways we cannot yet fully predict. Consider what the administration has structured here in terms of incentives. Companies that enter into most favored nation pricing agreements with the Department of Health and Human Services and onshoring agreements with the Department of Commerce will face a 0% tariff through January 2029. Companies that only enter into onshoring agreements will face a 20% tariff. Companies that do neither face the full 100%. So the administration has built a tiered system of compliance, carrot and stick, layered and conditional. And on the surface, that sounds like sophisticated policy design, but look at what it actually demands. It demands that pharmaceutical companies simultaneously commit to building American factories and commit to selling drugs at the lowest price paid anywhere in the developed world. Both of those things at once. Lower prices and higher capital expenditure. Any first-year business student can tell you those two objectives are in tension with each other. You cannot slash your revenue and simultaneously fund billion-dollar domestic manufacturing programs without something giving way. What gives way, historically, is research and development. There were projections from the American Action Forum that focusing on most favored nation pricing just for Medicare Part B drugs would result in 60 fewer drugs launching over the next decade. 60 fewer drugs. That is not a statistic about corporate profits. That is a statistic about future cures that will not exist, about diseases that will remain untreated because the financial model for developing new treatments has been fundamentally broken. Now, I want to be careful here because none of this means that the status quo was acceptable. It was not. The American pharmaceutical pricing system before all of this was, and there is no polite way to say it, a racket. Americans have been paying 2, 3, 4 times what Europeans and Canadians pay for identical medications produced by the same companies. The most favored nation logic, that the United States should not pay more than other wealthy nations for the same drug, is not radical. It is obvious. It is the kind of obvious thing that politicians on both sides of the aisle have been saying for years without ever actually doing anything about it. So there is a legitimate case to be made that pressure was necessary, that the industry needed to be forced to move, and that without the threat of real consequences, nothing would have changed. That case is not wrong. The problem is the execution. The problem is the speed, the bluntness, the lack of transition planning, and the almost complete disregard for what happens to patients in the immediate term while the long-term restructuring is being built. Dozens of drugs made in Canada for the US market are only or predominantly manufactured in Canada, and these drugs include HIV treatments that help extend people's lives. If tariffs are enacted, patients and pharmacists might start seeing an impact in a matter of weeks. A matter of weeks, not years, not decades, weeks. That is the time horizon we are talking about for some Americans who depend on these specific supply chains. And the drugs at risk are not lifestyle medications. They are not optional treatments. They are antibiotics. They are antidepressants. They are HIV medications. They are drugs for epilepsy. These are the medications that stand between people and hospitalization, between people and death. The professor from Northeastern University who said, "We are treading in new waters here," was being diplomatic. What he was describing was a system being pushed into territory it has never navigated before, by a policy that moved faster than any contingency plan could follow. The geopolitical dimension of all this runs even deeper. Look at the structure of the tariff exemptions, and you start to understand the real architecture of what is being built. Countries like the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Switzerland face a 15% tariff rate based on previous trade agreements. The United Kingdom faces a 10% tariff following a recently concluded pharmaceutical agreement. But Canada, despite being America's closest neighbor, its oldest ally, sharing the longest undefended border in the world, receives no such favorable treatment. Think about what that tells you. Countries across the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean are receiving better terms than the country that shares a land border with the United States. That is not an accident, that is a signal. It is a signal about how Washington views the relationship with Ottawa, about the broader renegotiation of what North American partnership actually means in the era of economic nationalism. Canada exported roughly $3 billion in pharmaceuticals to the American market annually. The Vice President for Strategic Policy and Supply Chains at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce warned that the tariffs could harm Americans' health with immediate price hikes, strained insurance systems, hospital shortages, and the real risk of patients rationing or foregoing essential medicines. Rationing medicines in the United States of America in 2026. That sentence should stop every American in their tracks, because we have seen what happens when people ration medications. We saw it during the COVID pandemic when supply chains buckled and hospitals scrambled. We saw it during the chemotherapy drug shortages of recent years when oncologists had to make impossible choices about who got what. We are not talking about hypothetical futures here. We are talking about a dynamic that has already played out before on a smaller scale, and that is now being amplified by policy choices made with a view toward long-term national strength, but with very little apparent thought about short-term national health. What you are witnessing is a collision between two legitimate but incompatible timelines. The administration is operating on a 5 to 10 year timeline: build the factories, reshore the supply chains, restore American pharmaceutical independence, reduce drug costs. That is a valid strategic vision, but Americans who depend on specific medications are operating on a monthly timeline: fill the prescription, take the pill, maintain the treatment. Those two timelines do not align, and when they collide, it is always the person with the monthly timeline who pays the price because they cannot wait. They cannot tell their HIV or their epilepsy or their depression to pause while the geopolitics sorts itself out. This is the moral core of the story that gets lost in the trade war framing. We talk about supply chains as though they are abstract systems. We talk about tariffs as though they are economic instruments operating in a value-neutral space, but every link in that supply chain is a patient, every percentage point of cost increase is a copay that someone cannot afford. Every drug that disappears from a pharmacy shelf is a person who does not get their medication that month. Research warns that US tariffs on pharmaceuticals will likely drive up costs and cause shortages of important Canadian-made drugs like antibiotics, antidepressants, and treatments for HIV and epilepsy. These are the specific categories of human suffering that this policy puts at greater risk. And what is striking, what is almost philosophically remarkable, is that this is happening in the name of making America's drug supply more secure. The stated goal and the immediate effect are pulling in opposite directions. The broader lesson here, and this is the thing worth carrying away from all of this, is about what happens when a nation that has spent decades exporting its industrial capacity to the cheapest corners of the world suddenly decides it wants that capacity back. It does not come back quickly, it does not come back cheaply, it comes back through years of capital expenditure, regulatory approvals, workforce training, and supply chain rebuilding. The year 2025 was defined by escalating global trade tensions that fundamentally reshaped the pharmaceutical supply chain, forcing major companies to commit billions to domestic manufacturing to avoid crippling import tariffs. That reshaping is real. That is happening. Eli Lilly committed to new American facilities. Merck announced new domestic production capacity. These are genuine changes to the industrial landscape, but changes to the industrial landscape take time to become changes to the medicine cabinet. And in that gap, in the years between the policy and the factory, between the announcement and the actual pill, ordinary Americans are left to navigate a supply chain that is being deliberately disrupted in the name of making it stronger. Understanding what is actually happening here requires stepping back from the political noise, from the tariff numbers and the press conferences and the social media posts, and asking a simpler question: who benefits and who bears the cost, and on what timeline? The answer, when you look clearly, is that large pharmaceutical companies, with the capital to build American facilities and the political connections to cut favorable deals, will ultimately benefit. The American patient who needs a niche medication manufactured by a small biotech company that cannot afford to build a new factory bears the cost, in the short to medium term, in the form of higher prices, reduced availability, and the very real possibility of shortages. That is the distribution of outcomes that this policy is producing. Whether it ultimately results in a more self-sufficient and more fairly priced American pharmaceutical system, that remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the transition is already proving painful for real people right now in real time.